Welcome, everybody. Times of crisis tap into our emotions. We can feel scared about our future, afraid of other people, and angry about freedoms we have to give up or might have to give up. With world-famous philosopher Martha Nussbaum, we will investigate the relationship between the emotional and the political. We will talk about the ways in which personal feelings and emotions influence our thoughts and actions. We will see how they might pose a risk to our democracy. And of course, we will also explore paths of hope. Martha Nussbaum, very welcome, a very big welcome to you. You are a professor of philosophy of law and ethics at the University of Chicago, and you have written more than 20 books, won numerous prizes, and also received many honorary degrees in universities all around the world. And I heard you have a new book already, which will be published in spring. But the immediate cause for this talk is your most recent book, The Monarchy of Fear. A philosopher looks at our political crisis. Well, you state in your book that you felt the urge to write this book, The Monarchy of Fear, in 2016. Immediately after Donald Trump became elected President of the United States. Why did this occasion, this election, prompt you to want to write a book about politics and emotions?
Well, I had been thinking of such a book for a long time, but what happened was that I was far away from all my friends. I was in Japan to get the Kyoto Prize. And so when I heard this news, I didn't have anyone to hug or to commiserate with or to worry with. And I was all by myself in a hotel room. All I could do was think and write. And so I did start writing down some of the ideas that had been swirling around in my mind for a long time. And I wanted to focus. I actually changed my views from my previous books because I had thought of each emotion as really quite separate. So one could talk about disgust in one book and anger in a different book and so forth. But what I began to see is that fear is really lying behind all the emotions. It is the earliest emotion of babies. It's also evolutionarily the most primitive. It belongs to all mammals at least, and probably all vertebrates. And I think it lies behind in some ways all of the other emotions and links them together and shows how, for example, anger can become politically dangerous. So I began thinking that fear was something I had ignored, and I had ignored the dynamic role of fear in propelling anger and disgust and all of the others. So that was basically the starting point, and then I just, of course, had to do it and work it all out.
I see. In your book, indeed, you picture us as humans, as a species, as an extraordinary species. Our babies, newborn humans, are vulnerable for a much longer period of time than other animals. And here I quote you, "The discrepancy between the very slow physical development of human infant and its rapid cognitive development, is in many respects a nightmare story." And you say this existential situation of helplessness, physical helplessness and cognitive input elicits fear. Can you expand a bit on that?
Well, when I say it's a nightmare, I think we all have nightmares where something terrible is happening and we want to move, and we find in the dream we can't move. We want to call out and we can't call out. Well, of course, that's the way babies are. And I think that nightmare preserves the horrible memories of that early state, that babies are, of course, often in pain. They're hungry, wet, cold, lonely, and yet they can't move to get what they want. Any other animal, if it couldn't move within a day, it would probably be dead. But humans, they depend so much on others to take care of them. But of course, even to summon those others, the baby is pretty powerless because it can't speak. All it can do is cry, and the cry is pretty indistinguished. And so I think it is a nightmare situation in many ways. And so that means that humans in particular, I think all animals have fear, And for all animals, fear plays usually a useful role in warning the animal about dangers. But for human beings, it's likely to get blown up to something of nightmare size that takes control in ways that are not always helpful.
So we feel fear in a way, and the only thing we can do is scream.
Yeah, I mean, if we're babies, we really just scream and wave fists around. And of course, we have to hope that there are caretakers who are alert to the different signs that we send out. But it's also the case that no caretaker is a slave. And babies really, I mean, this is where the title monarchy comes in. It comes from a passage where Rousseau says that young children, because they are powerless, can't do anything for themselves. They have to make slaves of other people. So instead of getting your own food, you have to make your parent come and bring your food. And he says this is a very bad preparation for democratic citizenship.
Yes.
And later, of course, he wants a meal. This is in his book about education. He wants a meal to learn to get his own food, because he says, look, the kings and nobles of France can't make their own clothes. They can't get their own food. And so that's why they feel they have to make slaves of other people. So, of course, we can be more self-sufficient when we get older. But that early experience that we have no choice but to make slaves of others, but at the same time, we're kind of treating them as comforting monarchs that control our whole lives. So the two sides of monarchy are both there in the early days. You need to make somebody a slave to get what you want, but you also utterly depend on that powerful figure. And of course, democracy needs equality, reciprocity, trust. And we can't have that if we're always running to some all-powerful figure who's going to take care of everything for us. But that impulse to do that, and of course, at the same time, to make slaves of people who don't do what we want, remains very powerful, and it surges up in times of danger and distress.
And that's why your book is called A Monarchy of Fear. It refers to that early situation in human life where we are helpless, fearful, and have to rely on people that we bully around, more or less, by screaming and by expressing our fear.
And it's a very rude shock to the baby, because I think children do have some experiences pre-birth, but those are comforting experiences. They're sloshed around in this warm liquid and all their needs are automatically taken care of. And then all of a sudden, the Roman philosopher Lucretius describes this very beautifully. He says the baby suddenly is lying on the ground, cold, naked, in need of every kind of life-sustaining help. And this is a rude awakening to this world, which is a world of delight, but also a world of great danger. And so that is something we have to learn to cope with. But of course, then what happens later is that we learn that even though we may become more competent and learn how to get what we want, we're going to die. And that knowledge, which comes in maybe the age of 5 or 6, that's another rude shock that throws us back into the arms of this primal fear. Well, Lucretius thinks that that's the biggest problem in politics, is the fear of death. We could argue about which fears are worse and so on. But the fear of death is certainly a very, very big fear, and it makes us unstable, I think, throughout our whole life. That when the fear of death suddenly occurs, when you get some bad diagnosis at a doctor's visit, or when a loved one is in the hospital, then you really, suddenly you're thrown back into your infancy, really, and you begin to act sometimes in quite infantile ways.
So we're talking now about infancy and about emotions, whereas this is announced as a talk about politics at our days. What is the connection? Why are we talking about this primal fear and about babies when we are supposed to talk about the world? But there is a connection for you. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, obviously how we are and how we can live together are very closely connected. And I think democracy is a really difficult achievement. To sustain democracy where people are not taken care of by one all-powerful figure, but have to cooperate together that kind of cooperation is very hard to sustain. It requires, as I said before, trust. And why would you trust someone else? You have to trust that they care for you, that they have benign intentions. It's not just reliance. I mean, trust, I think, means more than just relying on somebody, because you can rely on people you dislike to behave badly. But trust means you have to think that they have basically benign intentions, that they're going to, and we can cooperate together for the common good. And you know, in times when fear surges up, that is likely to be fragmented. And right now in my country, I think trust, it's almost impossible between people who differ on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. I try hard with my students who have different political opinions to get them into the same room and trusting one another to have a dialogue. But, you know, even in that very protected atmosphere of the university, it's getting increasingly hard for students who differ to trust one another, because they think these are evil people. They want bad things to befall me and my group. And that's on both sides, that mistrust. And of course, it's fed further by the lies that people circulate on the internet and this whole QAnon conspiracy, where quite a few people really believe that there's a big conspiracy on the left to have a ring of child molesters. This is a kind of crazy world. It's a world that, you know, it's hard to believe that any rational person believes that there's this huge conspiracy of pedophilia, that it's linked with the Democratic Party. I mean, there's plenty of pedophilia, and it's very bad, but that it should be linked with this pizza parlor in Washington and with certain Democratic politicians is all bizarre. But yet people, when they're scared, they'd rather believe some fiction than they would be at a loss for what to think and what to believe. So people cling to these internet fictions, and then that drives them further and further apart. So I think the degree of fear is really dangerous in US, and I suspect in most democracies today. And of course, COVID feeds both the good side of fear and the bad. I mean, of course, when there is a real danger, it's important to notice it, and it's very important to feel the appropriate degree of fear. If you didn't have fear, we'd all be dead many times before. But with COVID, it's important because then we would wear masks, we'd obey the social rules, and it's when people feel invulnerable and they don't feel fear that they behave stupidly. So that's the good side. Just last week, 100 students of our business and management school had this party where they broke all the state rules and all the university rules, no masks, no social distancing. And then, well, it was over 100 at the party, but 100 got positive tests for COVID. Now, we were talking, our faculty, why do law students not do that so much, and why do these business students do this more? We were thinking, well, people who go into law, of course, they care about rules and they care about law, and they're likely to be rather risk averse. Whereas these people who want to rule large corporations, they have a high degree of arrogance, a belief in their own vulnerability, and they just go out there and they think the rules don't apply to them. And I actually think that one could see those traits in our own president, that sense, oh, I'm invulnerable to everything. And any show of fear is taken to be a diminution of masculinity or effectiveness. So anyway, these people are, of course, endangering themselves, but even more, they endanger everyone around them. Because even if they don't live with elderly relatives, and even if classes, I mean, we have mixed online and in-person classes, but any faculty who want to can teach online, and most of them do. And of course, any elderly person like me, I'm teaching online, and I like that fine. But these business students, even if they're not endangering their professors or their parents, if they don't go home, who knows, they are endangering people in the stores where they shop. They're buying food, they're touching things. And of course, if they're not wearing masks, their droplets are going into the air all over the place, and they're going to gyms and so on. So they are endangering other people, and they don't care.
No.
And I think that's the bad side of fear.
And do they really not care, or is it that they more or less want to scream over their own fear? I mean, that they don't want to feel how fearful they are themselves. Because then they would have to admit that they are vulnerable.
Well, I think it's a mixture. I do think that as people get more and more tired of living indoors, they do just want to say, enough, we're going to go out and who cares, But I think these young business students, they really do want to feel, oh, because I'm young and I'm going to run a big corporation, I'm above the usual lot of human beings. And one would wish that that positive diagnosis would bring home to them the fact that they are mortal like everyone else, but you just don't know whether people learn or not. But then, of course, the bad side of fear is that you get so taken over by fear that you really can't do anything. And I do notice, I mean, I myself am really very happy right now. I have my son-in-law who lives with me to talk to. I can talk to my colleagues, and up until last week, I could eat outside in restaurants and so on. And I have relatives that I visit. But I don't mind, because I like to write, and of course the life of a writer is a pretty solitary life anyway. But I do know lots of people who can't get any work done because they're so fidgety and they're frightened all the time, and they're thinking, oh no, what's going to happen? And I think this does really debilitate people. There's a lot of lack of mental health now. There's a lot of course, the violence that goes with that. Domestic violence is surging in the U.S. because people are cooped up together with people they have problems with, but then they get more and more angry. And of course, the connection between fear and anger is something that we need to talk about. Yes, so shall we talk about that?
Because you say fear is primal, isn't it? But we look, of course, as Europeans, we look to the United States and see sometimes with amazement what is happening there. But we also see Black Lives Matter, and it is also in Europe a big movement. And you say there is a connection between fear and anger, and that anger can be nasty, but you also say that anger can be transformative. And is this the transformative type of anger, the type that fuels the Black Lives Matter movement?
Okay, well, let me take a step back, because I want to talk a little bit more about the connection between fear and anger. So first of all, I think when people are afraid, they don't want to rest. I mean, this is what you were saying before, with that sense of vulnerability. And so often they project it outwards and they make scapegoats of other people. So let's suppose you have a relative who dies in the hospital. People in the US particularly want to say, oh, that's not just an accident. The doctors did that. And we are a society that's very litigious because people want to blame others for things that probably is no one's fault. So that sense of somebody else must be to blame, it comes from something that psychologists call the just world hypothesis. We like to think, that the world is just, and when something bad happened, somebody else did it. But this kind of anger and scapegoating is all over the place, and it takes many forms. Now, then, what is anger? Now, since you said fear is primal, I want to say, even though these emotions may have early forms, they all involve some kind of thought. Fear involves a thought about danger and its imminence and your own invulnerability. I think this is true of animal fear too.
Because you have to see the connections. That's why it's thought. You have to see the causality.
Yeah, right, exactly. You have to see what the object is and why it matters and so on. But anger is even more sophisticated, and I think not all animals have that, because you have to think something bad was done by someone, and that it was done not just accidentally, but in some way wrongfully. So you have to have the concept of wrongful injury. Now, so far, so good. I think that's a very important concept to have. But then, in all the ancient and modern discussions of anger, there's this further part that is put into the definition, namely, it would be good for the person who did that to be punished. Now, that retributive reflex is probably very primitive. I'm sure that it evolved because it was useful. To strike back when somebody strikes you is really very natural in a way. But when you think about it, it doesn't do any good. Striking back does not bring back the one who was dead. People in my country want capital punishment when some child of theirs is killed, because they somehow have this fantasy that if you kill the killer, the child will be brought back to life. And of course, they deny that they have that fantasy, but at some level they do. It seems like the balance of nature must be restored. And that's why they demand what they call proportional payback. But payback doesn't really do any good. Punishment sometimes does do good. But when punishment does good, I think it does good because it expresses social norms, telling people this is very important, don't transgress it, because it deters that same person from doing it again, and because it deters other people from doing it in the first place. So I think punishment can be very useful, but it's not retributive punishment. You're not thinking it's because of the past, but it's because of the future that we punish. Now, then, and this is really what you were asking about, there is a type of anger that's purely future-oriented. This is what I call in the book transition anger, because it turns from the past to the future and says, that's outrageous, it must not happen again. So it's a kind of protest, but a protest that faces forward. It's not mindlessly focused on inflicting retrospective pain, but rather on making a better world. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. laid great emphasis on the distinction between these two kinds of anger, because he saw all around him people who had been deeply wronged, and there were two different things they could do. One is just to strike out and try to inflict pain. But he says, number one, that's useless. Number two, he says it's not even radical. It's just mindless. But the radical form of anger would be to try to use your protest to make the world better, to transform the world. So he was all the time telling this to his followers. And if you look at his great I Have a Dream speech, you see that he gradually leads the audience from this mindless retributive anger to a future-directed dream for a different world. Then it's not just an idle dream, it's a dream they have to make real. Now, I think that, the Black Lives Matter movement is not one thing. It's not an official movement, really. It's many different kinds of protests. And I think, just as in King's time, the protests have these two forms. There's a kind of sense of, well, let's just make them suffer. And a lot of the looting and the vandalism have that form, just as in King's day. There was very similar rioting. And Malcolm X, at least King thought that Malcolm X encouraged that, whether he did or not, leave to another time. But in terms of what we should do to make the world better, that's not likely to be very useful. And so, of course, there's always a question of whether some type of violence might be useful. Some revolutionaries have thought that when nonviolent tactics have totally failed, Nelson Mandela, for example, he turned to a limited use of violence to get the world's attention. But he used it very carefully in a very future-directed way for limited instrumental purposes, and it was violence against property, not against people, and so on. So I'm not totally against violence in certain very limited instances, but I do think usually it causes more trouble than it solves. And the nonviolent expressive form has often proven to be a very effective form of protest. Think about Gandhi, how this one semi-naked man got the whole British Raj to capitulate. It's pretty amazing when you think of it. And they just didn't know what to make of Gandhi, but they kept trying to beat these people and club them. And so, but when the people reacted with dignity and nonviolence, they saw that there's a spirit there that they couldn't touch, and it's inside, and it's the spirit. And of course, Gandhi wanted to show the world that Indian people were dignified, that they weren't just children, that they had great capacity for restraint, and that they, of course, could run their own nation. So he showed all that, and in the process, he built the modern nation. And I think King did the same thing with race relations. Of course, it's part of a history, and he didn't solve all the problems. But when you think about what things were like in the 1960s and what they're like today, well, we still have a huge number of problems today. But interracial marriage then was illegal in 16 states. Now, of course, since 1967, it has not been illegal. And there are lots of interracial marriages all over the country. It's a pretty normal thing, and I think people don't really even lift their eyebrows at it. And there are lots of, everywhere you turn, there are Black people in leadership positions, not enough, not as many as there should be, and so forth, but in university leadership, in government, and so on, there are a lot of such people. And just look at Kamala Harris running for vice president. So she's somebody who, if the Democrats win, she could someday become president. And that would be, of course, the first Black woman to be president, but we've already had a Black man. So, there has been progress. And so we have to keep soldiering on and make more progress. And I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement has gotten the attention of a lot of white people who didn't care and didn't really think there was a problem and so on. And so I hope that more progress will come from that.
Yeah, beautifully said. And for me, a moral eye-opener is that a real radical, you say, is not vindictive, is oriented towards the future. And that's beautiful. I really remember that. So that's one thing I already get out of our talk. But I also see, basically you say, examine your emotions, understand your emotions. And philosophy, you say, is about leading the examined life. But emotions are also, they are upheavals, they're immediate, they're often very powerful. So it's so difficult when you feel, especially when you feel emotional, to examine them. So where does it leave us? Isn't it not a bit, it doesn't seem to suit?
Well, I think, of course, they're not always sharp upheavals. There are what I call background emotions that kind of simmer along in the background of your life. Like, let's say, your love for a child. Now, you don't just sit there feeling warm love all the time. Probably a lot of the time you are irritated and overtired and so on. But of course, the love is there in the background. And I think compassion is like that too. And I even think that fear is like that. The fear of death, of course, we all have. And it conditions our actions in many ways. I'm sure when I get on my treadmill, which is right behind me here, I'm motivated partly by the fact that I love running, partly by habit, but partly also by the fear of death and the desire to preserve my health, of course. And, if we didn't have a fear of death, we would probably do many heedless things that would endanger our safety. So there's background emotions. I think that really the one reason to study both literature and philosophy, to study the humanities, is to engage in this kind of inner scrutiny. Now, I also think psychoanalysis is very valuable. I've never actually been analyzed myself, but I'm on the board of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, which is full of humanists now, not just trained analysts. And, I think that kind of psychotherapy, talking therapy, is very useful in illuminating for an ordinary person their hidden pockets of emotion in their lives. But we don't necessarily have to go to psychoanalysts. We can just read a poem and think about it, talk about it with others. I was so happy to see that Louise Glück won the Nobel Prize last week. I know her a little bit. I admire her poetry incredibly. I'm right now teaching a graduate seminar on tragedy and philosophy. So we spent part of the class last week thinking about how her poetry focuses us on our own emotions. She takes very common myths from the Greek and Roman world, like the Odyssey story, for example, in her book Meadowlands, and she gets you through the prism of that myth, which we can all relate to. She studies the whole issue of a breakup of a long-term relationship. So here's Penelope converging toward Odysseus and eventually being reunited with him. And here's Louise talking about the breakup of her own marriage. And they kind of crisscross and talk back and forth to each other. And it's incredibly illuminating. It really helps you think about relationship. What is the element of luck? What is the element of will? And it really shows you that we're kind of at the mercy of luck in so many ways, because we might have been Penelope, but again, we might end up like the Louise of the poet cycle. So I think great poets of many, many kinds can help us understand our own emotions. And I think philosophy has its place to play too. It's not just, of course, it's not just poetry, but it's also visual art. And I particularly am fond of talking and writing about music, about the way that music helps us explore our emotions. The last time I was out of the US was to visit the Concertgebouw and talk to the patrons of the Concertgebouw about the role of music in public culture. And I do think that music, not just classical music, but that happens to be what I myself know best, helps us also focus in on our emotions and see their structure at a time when we ourselves are not in the midst of them.
I see.
The philosopher Schopenhauer said that, we can't really study our emotions when we're in the turmoil of them, and this is what you're saying. Yeah. But he said then that's what the arts are for, and he particularly did value music because it helps us understand the structure of human desire and human striving. Now, he was very pessimistic and thought it always ended badly and that we ought to just detach ourselves from all of it. But we don't have to agree with him about that to think that music is enormously valuable if we want to understand loss and longing and hope and so forth. I mean, hope too, right? I just watched a wonderful production of Beethoven's Fidelio, and that's such an incredible work. And in a way, it has all the fragility of hope, because it's a story about justice being done in a time of great injustice through the courage and the love of one woman who goes to save her husband. And everyone today says, well, of course, that's a myth, it's a fiction, Beethoven was very naive. No, I don't think he was naive. He knew that justice and the attempt to do the right are always fragile. The world is full of bad people and plenty of obstacles to things ending well. But I think what that opera shows, and I found myself tears running down my face at the end, is that the quality of love and hope in her great aria, Komm, O Hoffnung, it's just the hope that sustains her, dressed as a man for years working in this jail. And she does it out of love, and then hope sustains her. And I think that hope, we understand that through the quality of the music. It surges up in that aria, which is such a wonderful aria. And, also at the end, when the two are reunited, they say, oh, nameless joy. And again, the music shows you this joy, which of course is very fragile, but it shows you the shape of something that we can make real if we really invest ourselves and commit ourselves in the way that Leonora did.
Mm-hmm. So you say the arts for you, and probably for everybody, are a way to practice emotions, among many other things, but also a way to investigate and to become more familiar with a whole range of emotions. And that might help you to understand what happens in a situation when you yourself are feeling a particular emotion. I mean, you said a lot more, but that's also a relation to when you feel anger.
I think it's important. I mean, I think we are born with the capacity to experience all these emotions, but often in a very crude and infantile form. And so then how do we get to a greater sophistication and greater accuracy and greater adequacy of our emotions to the complicated reality that we're in? And I really do think the arts, of course, philosophy also play a tremendous role. And so this is one reason why I think that it's incredibly dangerous to cut programs in the humanities in schools and universities, because then you're going to have a lot of people who know how to do computer programming, but they don't know how to understand the grief and the suffering of another person. And that's a very dangerous world to be in.
I agree. You're practicing to the converted here, at least.
Yeah.
You say, to the way forward, you say we need a loving and imaginative vision. when we want to improve our political or public situation. What is love in this respect? Or what type of love are you talking about? And can you tell us a bit more about the role of imagination when it comes to our public future?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me start with something that's a little too simple, which is that, I mean, the king always said, oh, the love I'm talking about is not romantic love, because of course you don't feel that for your enemies. And he said it's not even friendly love, because you don't have to like these people. And so what he wanted to say is it's some form of basically the Christian notion of agape, that is a love directed at the deep humanity of every person that makes them capable of change, capable of willing the good, even if right now they're not doing it. I think that's part of it, but I guess I think that in public life we find, since our deepest emotions are linked to our early experiences, which are highly particular, their experiences with our parents, and so they have this highly charged, I want to say sort of quasi-erotic character. The intensity of emotion often has to be summoned into being by images that are more particularistic, more, so to speak, erotic, images of the country. And King did this in his speeches. He may have said one thing, but when he talks about let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California and the heightening Alleghenies of Pittsburgh, well, he's using these quite erotic images to summon a kind of charged emotion in the public. He knew how to manage it. And of course, the minute you get into that very particularistic territory, it's fraught with danger, because some bad person can use it badly. But, you know, you need that element. And this is why even public art has to be not just, you know, sort of realism, socialist realism was a great failure artistically, because it didn't touch people where they were as frightened little children. In my earlier book, Political Emotions, I talk about this Millennium Park in Chicago, which has images. I mean, so it has this one wonderful fountain by Jaume Plensa called Crown Fountain, which has two screens on which are oversized pictures of Chicagoans of different races and ages, which are quite funny because they're moving in slow motion. So it might take the image 5 minutes to raise an eyebrow. But then in the middle is this water. And water is a very charged image, because going together into the water in terms of American history is fraught with ideas of racial mixing. One of the first things the South wanted to do was ban interracial use of swimming pools. And in fact, some states closed all the public swimming pools so that they wouldn't be integrated. And this is also true in South Africa. So mixing of people in the water, but it's so delightful and it's so funny. So people of all ages and all races are paddling around in the water. And the artist has deliberately constructed a space of really miscegenation, of interracial mixing. So that's just one example of how something quite devious and subversive about a work of art can help people get together. And I think the other one in the Millennium Park that's quite wonderful is what's called Cloud Gate. It's a sculpture by Anish Kapoor. It's a large, very large stainless steel sculpture that's in the shape of an inverted kidney bean, so it reflects lots of things. It's called Cloud Gate because it reflects the buildings and the sky, and it has this aspect of being very beautiful and very sublime. But when you walk up to it, it also reflects you and your family. And of course, you look very funny because it's like a funhouse mirror and you look curved and distorted. So it has the sublime and the ridiculous together. And I think this helps people also come together and see each other as similar in their vulnerability to being made ridiculous, but also in their love of ideals and love of beauty. It's really a fantastic artwork. So, you know, these things that are not Christian love in its most simplistic form, in the way King would describe it, but that are really very bodily and very subversive, are an essential part, I think, of what brings people together through the arts.
Yeah. I read your book as a heartfelt plea, dare to be vulnerable. It's so important to acknowledge that you are vulnerable. Why is this so important, and how do you practice it? How do you practice being vulnerable?
Well, I think you probably need to get the right cues when you're young, otherwise it becomes much harder. And it is quite noticeable that for many decades anyway, and probably centuries, girls and boys have been treated somewhat differently in this respect, that for little girls it's all right to admit to fear, but little boys have to tough it out and, never show fear. And people even perceive babies this way, so that in experiments where there is a baby whose sex is not known, and they'll say to the experimental subject, would you hold her for me or would you hold him for me? They ascribe to the child's crying quite different emotions. So if they think it's a little girl, they'll say, oh, poor thing, she's so frightened. But if they think it's a boy, they'll bounce the child in the air. Oh, he really wants to get what he wants, And so, if you give the child that message, that to be manly, you can't be vulnerable, that's a terrible message, because, of course, you are vulnerable. So what do? It invites lying and shame, shame that goes inward and fuels a kind of anger. And a lot of teenage acting out, I think, is the result of this anger, where you perceive that you're suddenly in this world of sex relations of various kinds. You don't know how to control it. And so you pretend, of course, that you're in control. And I do. I mean, in my new book that's coming out in May is about sexual abuse. And I think the central vice in my book is the vice of pride. In Dante's sense, I talk a lot about Dante's wonderful part about pride in the Purgatory, where the proud are bent over like hoops. They can't see another person because all their vision is turned on themselves. No one else is fully real. And this, in a way, comes from not wanting to be vulnerable. You can't let anyone else to have reality. And so I'm saying in the book that this is what ultimately leads to the treatment of women as interchangeable sexual objects, and, of course, to acting that out, in some cases, violently. So what we really need to do is to get rid of pride. And that means, starting early and saying, look, we have interconnectivity and we support one another and we're all in this together. And I think, the responsibility is partly from parents, partly, of course, the teachers and the media culture. But there's so many messages that kids are getting that it's very hard to, even for very good, loving parents, to prevent this overweening pride from taking hold. But there are institutional things we can do. We can have what we did not have when I was a student, laws against sexual harassment, which notify people when they're still malleable and very young, don't treat women that way. No, you're going to get a punishment. Now, of course, that's just superficial if you were doing it out of fear of punishment. But let's hope people internalize that as the time goes on and just think, no, that's not the way to behave. Another thing you can do is not give disproportionate place in universities to sports. I have a whole chapter on let's get rid of college sports, which I do think is a great encourager of vice, because these young athletes are taught from an early age that they're above everyone else because they're going to make money for other people. That's the bottom line. And so they're encouraged to act out their desire to treat women as objects. There's incredible level of sexual assault in college sports programs at pretty much every university that has a big college sports program. And it has nothing to do with real sports, which should be about mutual regard, mutual dependency, and about accepting the equality of all people. And actually now in the professional sports world, there's a lot of movement to be much more democratic. I think I particularly admire the U.S. basketball world, which has actually been a model of manly behavior in the COVID times, the bubble. People lived in the bubble, they obeyed all the rules, and expressed their concerns with great thoughtfulness, great manliness. And I think it's partly because the commissioner of basketball, who's actually an alum of our law school, Adam Silver. He really has stood for gender equality all along the way. He's made the NBA take a leading role. He aims to have, of course, there are women playing basketball too, but he's only in charge of the men's league. But he wants to have the same number of women coaches as men coaches, and the same number of women referees as male referees. And he says that's his aim. He's going to make that happen in the next few years. And
it blends into his other behavior. I'm sorry, because time is flying, and I want to pose you a last question before we go to the Q&A with the public. You mentioned it already, and it's also in your book, that you say that people have a deep-rooted need to believe that the world is just. And when I read your book, it dawned on me that maybe you are asking us as all the people, to understand that life in and by itself is not fair. So that we don't project our disappointments about the unfair life onto our fellow human beings. Do I understand you correctly?
Basically, yes. Now, I think it's always hard to sort out in the particular case. And if there is unfairness, you better find it and name it and try to correct it. So, these people who are suing the doctors that I talked about, they go to extremes, but it's not entirely wrong to ask the question, did the doctors do something culpably wrong? And I think that way we get progress in the standard of care, and we get the doctors not to have overweening pride, which is something that doctors are kind of likely to have. And so there has been progress in medical ethics through much more autonomy on the part of patients, through patients really, watching out for whether something is wrong. So I don't think we should stop trying to figure out when something is unjust. But I think we also have to know, this is what Greek tragedies, of course, are telling us. Greek tragedies ask us to sort this out. A play like Euripides' Trojan Women, of course, some of the behavior is just human bad behavior that should be stopped. Women being raped in wartime, women being sold into slavery. But then again, there are things that are hard to stop. It's hard to stop people's desires from leading them to do things that are irrational and so on. But in a more general way, of course, the world is always going to be a world in which every person who's born is going to die. And that's the long and short of it. So when we talk about injustice, we have to remember the death is going to happen, and it's always unwelcome. Is it unjust? Well, I think that would be peculiar to say that. That's just the nature of human life. So it's a question of getting the right balance.
Thank you very much. I will give now the floor to Machteld, because she, I think, has some questions from the audience. Is that correct, Machteld?
Yes, that is correct. There's many questions from the audience, but I will pose the one that's voted up the most. And it is, do you believe that certain cultures or societies are particularly effective in overcoming the fear impulse? And if so, which communities would be that, and why?
Well, let me just quickly say that I don't think we should completely overcome it. I think we should make sure that we get it focused on the truth and not allow ourselves to be manipulated rhetorically by false news and false fears. Which societies are more, I think the societies that are more successful are the ones where there is a larger amount of interdependence and this sense of people identifying with one another. And it's hard to talk about another society which you haven't lived in, but I did a lot of my development work in Finland with Amartya Sen and other people. But I think in Finland, everyone feels that it's sort of like a big family. And therefore, when one person has a death, they want to make sure that the public provision is good for everyone. I remember my collaborator there, Juha Siivola, died of bone cancer, and I was terrified. And I said, because he had a wife who was in her 50s, just beginning her PhD dissertation, and 2 children in their teens. Well, if they had been in the US, there would have been lots of reason to be feared afraid because they would have been destitute. But in fact, in Finland, everyone said, no, no, no. There's this program for widows and orphans, and there's this free public education, and of course the healthcare system and so on. So there was no problem, really. I mean, of course, a great tragedy. But I think that's what politics can supply, is the limit of fear. That is, things can't be worse than that. This is the threshold or the floor of your fear. And death is always terrible. Losing a husband and father is always terrible for a family. But you're not going to have to face economic destitution. You're not going to have to face the loss of health care. Now, how did they get that? They got that because everyone identifies with everyone else. There are some problems with that, I think. I mean, I do not think Finland is an ideal society because it's predicated on a sense of ethnic and cultural similarity, which makes it very hard to accept racial difference or ethnic difference, even to the extent that I know people from Sweden who teach in Finland and they're still thought of as foreigners, even if they've lived in Finland for 20 years. Now, so I guess if I had to try to find the right mean, maybe some of the larger European countries, and I don't know the Netherlands that in those respects well enough. I do think in Germany, there's a pretty good balance of being able to accept ethnic and cultural difference up to a point. I think it could be better, but still having enough of a sense of we're all in this together, we have solidarity, that policies are supported that put a floor under people's fear so that people are less likely to be swept away by fear. So, I mean, that's the way I'm thinking. So really, my capabilities approach was a way of approaching fear from the side of what are the things that no society should let people fear? Hunger, lack of health care, et cetera, et cetera. And so we get that kind of provision only if we have a certain degree of solidarity, people being able to imagine, and this is what the questioner asks about, imagine one another in one another's shoes. I don't think that has to rest on this Finnish sense, oh, we're all blonde and we're all Protestants, which unfortunately is still there, even though Finns are not all blonde and Protestant. But I think it has to be nourished in a more complicated way by public media, by the rhetoric of leaders who lead people to see the different groups as similar. I do think Angela Merkel is such a leader, and she's one of the people living in the world that I admire most, because I think she really does try to lead people to see immigrants as people who might be them and so forth. But in any case, that's the sort of thing that has to happen.
Thank you so much. I think you've been speaking already some about the interconnectedness we need and about how art can be a space for reflection. I think this question has to do with that, as reflexes can rule us in a way, we need reflection. So this person is asking, do you agree that we need to develop new collective forms of reflection? I think other than art could be a place like that. Like what kind of spaces and practices would be good for that, do you think?
Well, I think we found out in this pandemic some new forms that are pretty interesting. We don't have to go to operas and concerts that are live. We can join these over the internet. And of course, sometimes we're just not aware of the other participants, but there are many things that are happening now that do involve an audience, that you can see the audience or hear from the audience. So I think this is one thing, and it is happening more and more. And I think when the pandemic ends, that will live on because people have found it's very valuable. You don't have to bring a guest speaker all the way to whatever the place is. You can actually connect, right? Like this, right? Now, you know, so I think we're discovering this. I do feel that the in-person should not stop. I'm a little worried about this because I think people now think, oh, it costs so much money to bring in a visiting speaker. Let me just do something on Zoom. But I think the in-person has a special liveliness and vitality. I find I myself, when I travel and I meet a new group of people, I learn more from them. But I think we should certainly explore that. And, there are all kinds of things that we should explore more. I think great cities have great resources for exploring new ways of getting together, groups, discussion groups, book groups. It's much harder in the US for people in rural areas to find those ways, especially if they're aging and they have a hard time traveling from one place to the other. But for that too, I think the online has become really very valuable, because people who are aging, now they can access culture. In all the culture that there is, you can access from your home. And so that's pretty good, I think. So I guess, we'll figure it out. But I think we should explore the really benign and beneficent possibilities of online media. And we're learning how to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a way ahead of us for that. The last question in this Q&A is a quite personal question. And it is, what frightens you the most?
Well, actually, I have to go into the past a little bit. And my daughter died a little less than a year ago. She was a wonderful woman, age 47, a lawyer for animal rights, and she died of a drug-resistant infection after surgery. And, it was a very long period of going to the hospital every day. And that, even though now it's past and there's nothing more to be done, it still frightens me the most, in the sense that I'm not out of it. I mean, I don't think I ever will be out of that sense of grief and fear. But I think now that I'm at the point where I want to write about grief and fear, because I want to draw from that experience something that I might be able, that other parents who have lost adult children, to help them reflect on those emotions. I might be able to do that. So anyway, that's where I am right now, just thinking that maybe not now, it's too raw still, but in maybe 3 years, I might be able to write something about grief that would be both, I think tragedy, as Aristotle says, it's philosophical because it's general. It's things such as might happen. But I think what he left out is that any grief is always very particular. But it's in its particularity, really, that it is general. Because, of course, no one loses a child. They always lose this child who has these particular habits and ways of speaking and so on. So I think balancing the particular and the general is what I hope to do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha Nussbaum. I'm almost speechless because of this candid and very personal talk and the answer to the last question. I feel very sorry for you, but I'm sure if anyone can say something beautiful and uplifting about mourning, it will be you. So I want to thank you for your cooperation, for your willingness to talk to us, for your very lively and beautiful talk. And whenever you can come to Holland, feel free. You're very welcome with us.
Well,
and we hope you can travel.
I will. Next fall, at least, the Human Development and Capability Association will meet in Antwerp, and so I'll certainly be there. But I'll certainly hope to come to Holland many times.
Thank you very much. And
Thank
for
you.
the audience, this was the last talk in Brainwash Digital for this season. We hope to meet again with Martha Nussbaum and with each other. And I wish all of you a very good evening, and especially to you, Martha Nussbaum. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you for joining us at Brainwash Digital 2020. It was our very first online festival ever, so we're very happy that you were here, and we're also very curious to what you think. So please leave your opinion in the feedback form that will appear on screen, and the replay of this event will be available soon after we are finished, just in a couple of minutes. Thank you for joining us this year, and we hope to see you soon.